Geometry Dash is a game about beating levels and creating them. Most of these levels are made by passionate teenagers and young adults for almost no money. But recently, a YouTuber decided to treat one like a startup company. Over $115,000 spent. Paying creators, manufacturing plush toys, building a website, hiring lawyers, even adding a loot box style system where buyers don't know which plush variant they'll actually get. Professional photography, marketing campaigns in Spain, the Netherlands, China, and Japan, all for the sole purpose of expanding a single Geometry Dash level. So naturally, I started running the numbers. For those of you who don't follow Geometry Dash closely, allow me to share a little bit of backstory. If you've at least heard of the game, you might recall seeing something looking somewhat like this, a cube jumping over spikes. But through the game's highly advanced level editor, you can create your own levels that far exceed these limits, and make something truly worth remembering. These levels, whether known for their artistic designs or their extreme difficulty, have gathered millions of views over the game's 11-year history. One of the more recent levels to enter this tier of fame is known as Skeletal Shenanigans, created in a collaboration between YoReed and Erzi. Given the name of the level, the theme is, well, mischievously behaving skeletons, who do everything in their power to not only kill you, but take control of whatever this diamond is that runs throughout the level. From the high attention to detail in the designs, the seamless animations, and the absolute bop of the song Inferno, created by 3 legendary musicians in this game's community, this level exploded in popularity. It even won a GD award very recently. It's that good. So yeah, this level is a pretty big deal. And apparently, it was too big of a deal for a YouTuber named Wabu to ignore. The idea was simple: make Skeletal Shenanigans even greater, using their own capital to fund an 8-minute extension of the level with a full production team, and on top of all of that, unique merchandise in the form of these skeleton plushies. The concept of community merchandise isn't a new one to Geometry Dash, even in this context. Levels hosted by Mindcap, the likes of Limbo and Orbit very recently, ran their own campaigns. Mindcap themselves has even conducted campaigns for their own plushies, so the idea isn't a first for this community. Where this becomes truly unique is the scale of this campaign. Wabu didn't just make plushies. He paid creators to partake in the project. Well, not necessarily a foreign concept, especially recently, is rather uncommon to see. What is uncommon to see, however, is the creators being gathered together to work in real life, full-time on this extension. Community levels, even the big ones like Orbit and others, are conducted almost entirely off of voluntary involvement, or passion. Level creation is seen exclusively as a hobby, but this case is taking that hobby and turning it into full-time labor. Creators in this game often make their money through monetization, either by sharing their levels to YouTube, streaming their building process live on a streaming service like Twitch, or maybe, for the big boys, the occasional merchandise sales. It's certainly a first to see creators earning full-time wages for their artistic prowess. I wouldn't necessarily go as far to say this is flawed by any means, but it is absolutely unheard of for the scope of this community, which is what generated shock value for a lot of people who stumbled across this. However, 2 very different reactions formed after the project was announced. Fans of Wabu and Skeletal Shenanigans showed a quiet curiosity about the idea, but others raised some pretty big concerns, and not without reason. Within the confounds of this community, the level editor has always been seen as a place for artistic expression and passion. Most levels are built because creators simply want to make something cool. So when you suddenly introduce over $100,000 into the equation, that passion element starts to feel a little different. The level risks losing all of its identity, because instead of existing purely as a creative project, it now exists as a business venture. Another larger concern comes from the fact that YoReed, the uploader of Skeletal Shenanigans, isn't exactly enthusiastic about this project. Normally, this wouldn't be such a big deal. People make fan-made extensions of their favorite levels all the time. The real concern comes from the plushies themselves, which are based directly on the skeleton designs from the level. One could technically argue that Wabu is simply taking inspiration from YoReed's work, but there's definitely a fine line between inspiration and plagiarism. I'm not an artist myself, so I can't really draw that line. And I'm definitely not a lawyer, so I can't say whether YoReed would have a legal case here. However, after looking into it a little further, the legal situation might actually be much simpler than it first appears. According to Geometry Dash's terms of service, levels uploaded to the official servers are ultimately owned by the game's developer, being RobTop, which means that technically speaking, individual creators don't fully own the levels they upload to the game. In other words, while some people may still take an issue with the situation from a community etiquette perspective, there may not actually be a legal barrier preventing this project from existing in the first place. And with that question mostly out of the way, we can return to the more interesting one, the question that I actually can answer as an economics student. Is it profitable? Because at the end of the day, this entire project revolves around one thing: plush toys. The skeleton plushies are currently expected to sell for 40 euros each, which sounds like a lot, until you remember that selling something for 40 euros doesn't mean you actually make 40 euros. Manufacturing plush toys isn't cheap. Between production, packaging, shipping, and payment processing fees, the profit margin is usually about half of the retail price. In other words, the profit margin here is likely somewhere around 15 and 20 euros per unit. And that leads us to our first real question. If Wabu spent $115,300 funding this project, how many plushies would he actually need to sell to break even? Well, take that $115,300 and divide it by the profit per unit and you get your answer. At a 20 euro profit margin, Wabu would need to sell roughly 5,000 plushies just to cover the initial investment. But if the margin drops to 15 euros per unit, that number jumps all the way up to around 6,600 plushies. So realistically, we're looking at somewhere between 5,000 and 6,600 plushies needed just to break even. And that's where things start to get a little more complicated. Because plushies may be the primary engine for this project, but they're not the only possible source of revenue. There's another factor that could significantly change the equation: YouTube ad revenue. I'm inclined to believe that a large video will eventually be released on Wabu's channel, explaining the full story behind this project. And historically, these types of videos have performed very well for him. His highest performing uploads have surpassed 4 million views. So there is absolutely potential for a viral video here, if the project is marketed correctly, because the early results haven't been very good to say the least. But let's assume best case scenario for a moment. Let's say Wabu uploads a 20-minute video explaining the project and it performs reasonably well. For gaming channels, a typical RPM, or revenue per 1,000 views, is around $4. That means if the video gets 1 million views, it makes $4,000, 2 million, 8,000, and so on. Of course, this estimate does not include sponsorships, which could easily multiply this number several times over. But out of caution, I'm going to leave these out of fear of overfitting or overestimating. Let's take a moderate scenario and assume that the video reaches 2 million views. At a $4 RPM, that would generate about $8,000 in revenue. That alone would reduce the plush requirement by nearly 350 units at the 20 euro margin, or roughly 450 units at the 15 euro margin. That might not sound like much, but when you consider the size of the target audience, every bit helps. And that leads us to the next big question. How big is the Geometry Dash audience that might actually buy this? Geometry Dash has a massive community that only seems to grow over time. And when streamers like Jinxie start playing the game, you're almost guaranteed to see a new influx of players. Though it's very difficult to estimate just how big the Geometry Dash community actually is, but there are a few places where we can find some useful numbers. If you look at Steam charts, we can see that Geometry Dash is doing very well, averaging somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 players online at any given time. Another interesting reference point comes from the recent GD Awards, where the most voted category received roughly 92,000 votes. That number lines up surprisingly well with the activity we see on Steam, suggesting that the core, highly engaged community probably sits somewhere around 90,000 people. For the sake of this analysis, we'll call this Tier 1, the core community. But the core community is only a small slice of the total player base. Most games follow a rough rule of thumb where the number of players online at any given moment represents roughly 1 to 5% of the total daily player base. So if GD averages roughly 90,000 concurrent players, and we assume that represents about 2% of the daily active population, then the total daily player base could be somewhere around 4.5 million players. Now, is that number perfect? Definitely not. Geometry Dash doesn't publicly release player statistics, so any estimate here is going to have a margin of error. But when you consider that the game consistently ranks within the top 3 paid games on both Apple's App Store and the Google Play Store, it becomes very difficult to argue that Geometry Dash has anything less than a massive reach. But there is a very important distinction here. Reach doesn't equal buyers. Just because millions of people play the game doesn't necessarily mean millions of people are buying merchandise for it. Across most online stores, only about 2 to 4% of visitors actually end up buying something. And when it comes to creator merchandise, the conversion rate is usually somewhere between 1 to 5% of an audience, with 5% already being an extremely optimistic scenario. Now, Skeletal Shenanigans is a very popular level. But even in an optimistic scenario, only a small percentage of the community is actually going to buy a plush toy. So let's apply those numbers to the Geometry Dash audience. Earlier, we estimated that the core community is somewhere around 90,000 people. If only 1% of that community buys a plushie, that's about 900 units sold. At 3%, you're looking at around 2,700 units. Even if we go all the way up to a very optimistic 5% conversion rate, that would only result in around 4,500 plushies sold. Again, this number is already extremely generous. Creator merchandise rarely converts that high unless the audience is extremely dedicated. And it's also worth remembering that a large portion of the Geometry Dash community is fairly young, which can make discretionary purchases like merchandise far less common. And remember, based on our earlier calculations, Wabu likely needs somewhere between 5,000 and 6,600 units sold just to break even, which means that the core Geometry Dash community alone probably isn't enough to carry this project. For this to work, the project needs something bigger. It needs to reach beyond the core community. And that's where things like YouTube virality and broader marketing campaigns start to become extremely important. Not much is currently known about the exact measures being taken during the marketing process, but we do know that Wabu has listed the following countries where marketing campaigns are taking place: Spain, the Netherlands, China, and Japan. So let's break down each of these individually, starting with Spain. If you're trying to market toward the Geometry Dash community, Spain is actually one of the better options outside of the United States. The Spanish-speaking portion of the GD community is quite large, and many popular creators and players come from Spanish-speaking regions. So if the goal is to reach international audiences beyond English speakers, Spain, and even countries like Mexico would make a lot of sense as starting points. Next, we have the Netherlands, which is an interesting choice. Nothing immediately jumps out about the Netherlands as a major hotspot. However, the plush prices are listed in euros, which suggests that this project may be operating somewhere within the European market. And if that's the case, running marketing campaigns closer to home would be a pretty natural decision. That said, the Dutch Geometry Dash demographic is likely much smaller than the Spanish one. So from a purely strategic perspective, it might make sense to keep spending here somewhat limited. Not necessarily a bad choice, just not the strongest one on the list. Then we move into Asia, starting with China, which actually does make some sense. Plush manufacturing is very commonly done in China, and it's possible that existing connections there could make marketing somewhat easier. There also may be a small Chinese Geometry Dash audience to tap into, but even beyond the game itself, another possible strategy here could be marketing the plush purely as a standalone product, something that simply looks appealing, regardless of whether someone actually knows the level it came from. That might sound like a stretch, but it's honestly one of the few explanations that makes sense when we look at the final country on the list, Japan. This one is very interesting, because I actually studied abroad there for 3 months last year. Japan has a huge market for rhythm games. However, titles like Mai Mai, Chunithum, those are the rhythm games that dominate arcades and communities there. So when I was in Japan, I did see a lot of people playing rhythm games. But Geometry Dash? Nobody talked about it. And from the people I spoke with, the game seemed to be more of an afterthought in that market, which makes Japan a very curious place to focus a marketing campaign. Unless Wabu is planning to put an ad right in the middle of Shibuya Crossing, I'm not entirely sure how effective that strategy would be. So when you look at the marketing list, some choices make sense, and others raise a few questions. Interestingly, shortly after much of this information started circulating, the original trailer video for this project was actually set to private. Around the same time, Yoreed themselves released a statement explaining that they weren't directly involved in the project, and that the scale of it had grown far beyond what they originally expected. From a public relations perspective, this kind of mood is often the form of damage control. When a project begins receiving negative attention, temporarily pulling content offline can give the people behind it time to reassess how the project is being presented. Because if the narrative around the project turns negative, it becomes much harder for that project to reach audiences outside the core community. And that's important, because the Geometry Dash community alone probably isn't large enough to carry this project financially. So when you take a step back and look at all of this, one thing becomes very clear. The success of this project likely won't be determined by the Geometry Dash community alone. Instead, it will probably be determined by the amount of exposure it gets. It needs to reach people outside the traditional Geometry Dash audience. And interestingly enough, GD content has a history of doing exactly that. Some of the most viral videos related to the game have reached millions of viewers, far beyond the number of players who actively participate in the community. That means a large portion of the audience for these videos may not even play the game regularly. They're watching because the content itself is interesting. Whether that's a documentary about a level, a record-breaking completion, or just the story behind a massive project. And if Wabu can successfully position this extension as a story worth watching, that could dramatically change the economics of this project. Because the moment you start reaching millions of viewers, instead of tens of thousands, the potential buyer pool grows very quickly. Even a 1% conversion rate from a video with 1 million viewers could theoretically generate 10,000 buyers. Now, realistically, that kind of conversion is very unlikely. But the point is that scale matters. If this project becomes a viral story within the gaming space, the plush sales suddenly become much more plausible. But the opposite is also true. If the project fails to break outside the core Geometry Dash community, the numbers become much harder to justify. At the end of the day, this project is something Geometry Dash has never really seen before. It's taking something that has traditionally been a community hobby and attempting to turn it into something closer to a commercial production. Paying creators, manufacturing merchandise, running international marketing campaigns. From a purely analytical standpoint, it's actually a fascinating experiment, because the outcome will tell us something important about the Geometry Dash community itself. Is it large and engaged enough to support projects like this? Or is the game's influence mostly limited to its passionate core audience? Thank you for watching this video all the way through. And if you too also enjoy someone losing their mind over numbers and plushies, feel free to subscribe.